Alright, hello and welcome to our very first flipped lecture video. Today we're talking about our political beginnings. And by that we mean, how did our country start? Because if we understand how our country started, we'll better understand how our government operates today and why. So what is government? If you see this quote right here, it says, "If men were angels, there would be no need for government." What that means is that men and women left to themselves would do unlawful things, that they would be unruly, there'd be chaos. So what government does is that it gives us order and it gives us a civil society to live within. Keeps us safe. So what is government? It makes and enforces public policy. By that we mean laws. It gives us rules to live by, what we can and cannot do. It provides order, very important. We see this with our police officers, with our military, things like that. It protects and provides for meeting the needs of its people, whether that be education, social security, things like that. And ultimately, people need boundaries and common grounds. We need a basic understanding of where we stand. All right. And so from 1600 to the 1760s, we had a great influx of immigrants into what used to be known as Colonial America. We had people coming from France, Sweden, Spain, Netherlands, but primarily they came from England. Now obviously this makes sense because we were colonies of England. We belonged to England, which is today Great Britain, the British. Now why would these people come here? Well, think about it in your own lives as well. These people came because they felt that they didn't have the personal or religious freedoms that they deserved. They felt unsafe or unrespected back home. Commercial ventures, fertile soil. There was only so much land in England, and it was becoming less and less available. And so, in the colonies, there was vast amount of land where you could grow tobacco, cotton, all these great crops that you could make money off of. Poor laws. If I owed you money, you could sell me and my debt to someone going over to America. That person would pay you that debt back. And at the same time, I would work for that person who sent me over to America. So it was a way to repay debt for those who were poor. And finally, prisoners. England was becoming crowded, and they didn't want these unlawful people around, and so they sent them to America. All right, the 13 colonies. English controlled the new colonies and shaped their governments. However, there were three basic concepts of the governments in the U.S. at this time, Colonial America, that were kind of new. Well, one, it was ordered. Government was ordered. Government must be organized and follow orderly regulations with one another. It has to be a preset amount of rules. Number two, it's limited. Government should not be all powerful. It can't do whatever it wants. A government cannot arbitrarily throw you in jail. A government cannot, on a whim, decide to punish you. And finally, government is representative. Government should serve the people. Very important. The government only serves and functions if it represents what the people want. So if you look at this map here, you'll see that this is a Colonial America. Pretty big amount of land that we know of today as the eastern United States. But where is England? Well, England was all the way on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. It was quite the separation. And so why was England's location a problem? Well, if you think about it, if you were all the way over the other side of the Atlantic, that's 3,000 miles. Therefore, England could not run the day-to-day operations of the colonies. In order for that to happen, the colonies needed local governments that could deal with those things. And so, the colonies were largely self-governing. They were left to themselves due to the 3,000-mile distance. It would take 2 to 3 months for a ship to go one direction across the Atlantic Ocean. So if something went wrong in the colonies, it would take up to 3 months to get word back to the king, and another 3 months to do something about it. That didn't make it very efficient. And so it was a very relaxed relationship. The colonies provided England with tax money and resources. The colonies had crops like cotton, tobacco, things like that, that the English wanted for their goods. And so, in large part, they let the colonies govern themselves. However, that was all about to change in 1760. This is when King George III became the new king. He took over. His father had died. And so he inherited or became the new owner of all the debt from the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War was fought in order to protect the colonies from the French on the western borders along with the Indian tribes. Those two forces banded together and tried to take over some land. The British defended them, and so they felt that if Britain had defended the colonies should pay back that debt. And so he wanted to have more control of the colonies. And he did this in large part through new taxes and restrictive regulations. He exerted a lot more control. He became much more strict. And so during this time, we have this thinker by the name of John Locke. And his writings very much influenced the many leaders of the American Revolution. And these ideas were radical at the time, that all people were born free, equal, and independent, that people have to give consent or they have to agree to government in order for it to work, that government is only legitimate if people support it. And then this one in bold right here, very important, and make sure you circle it. It says, if a government fails to protect natural rights, the people could change the government. These were incredibly radical notions, that if you were upset and displeased with government, you had a right, nay, an obligation, to change it. Now, does this have meaning today? Do we see these same factors in play? We do. If we think to today, we think maybe of the Tea Party movement. Here are a group of citizens in the United States who are upset with the largeness and scope of government. They think it's too big, they want to decrease it. And so they think that taxes should be lowered, the government should be shrunken. So similar to what we heard back in the 1760s with a overly powerful government not obeying the wishes of the people, so too when the Tea Party say that that is what they stand for. And so the colonies responded. Now this was their first attempt to unite. Before, they were all independent units set up for different reasons. But we had what was called the Stamp Act Congress. There were representatives from each of the 13 colonies to meet to respond to the Stamp Act. What the Stamp Act was a harsh trade and tax policy on all legal documents, newspapers, and business papers. So anything that required a stamp, you had to pay a much higher tax on now. Now the colonies claimed and complained that this was taxation without representation. This is a very important idea from our early time. Taxation without representation. The colonists argued that they had no representation in the British Parliament, and so therefore they should not be taxed. They had no say in what levels they should be taxed at. And so when we think of why we pay taxes today, we think of all the services that government provides. The idea is if you want these, you'll need to pay for it. So the colonists were largely upset about how many new taxes were enforced upon them without their consent, without them agreeing to it. And so there's these 3 steps that are pretty much how every revolution follows. It's a very key concept. Number 1, you complain, you talk about it. And so you think that something's wrong. In the early America, they decided to write a protest. They wrote letters to complain to the king, petitions, saying, we disagree with what you did and this is why. Please change it. Well, as you can imagine, the king was not very privy, was not very open to that idea. He didn't want that to happen, so he didn't really respond. It didn't work. Well, then the colonists took it one step further. They did something. They had a call to action. They organized boycotts. Well, what a boycott is when you decide to stop purchasing a certain good. Say if I was really upset with Walmart. I didn't like Walmart for one reason or another. So what I could choose to do is stop buying their products. And if enough people stop buying those products, then that would send a message that the people are upset with that businessman, or in this case the government, because colonists stopped buying tea. They stopped buying stamps, things like that. But that didn't work either. the king just got more and more firm with his resolve. He became harder on them. And so this led to frustration. It led to violence. The colonists felt that they had no choice. And we're going to see some examples of that. Tar and feathering. This is when hot tar would be poured over a person's body. It would scald and burn their skin, and a bunch of feathers would be thrown out to them. This way they looked like a chicken. This is a very cruel and painful position to be in. The people who got this treatment were tax collectors. They were not very popular with the colonists. The Boston Massacre. A bunch of colonists who were protesting and upset with British rule, and well, a disagreement came about and the British soldiers fired on them. The Tea Act of 1773 was a new tax that put a tea, or that made it so that you can only buy British East India Company tea. This was one owned by the government, by the king. And so there's no middleman, and the North was expected that the colonists to eagerly choose the cheaper tea. So this was another thing that frustrated the colonists. And so this led to the Boston Tea Party of 1773. The colonists were upset that this was the only tea that they could have, that they thought that there was too much power being placed over them. And so a bunch of colonists dressed as Native Americans went over, grabbed the tea and dumped it in because they thought it was illegal. They thought that this tea was a sham. And so that led to our first national government, which were the First and Second Continental Congresses. Very important. Those were our first national governments. They came together by force of circumstance. It was temporary. They had no constitutional authority, but served as the acting government during war. So during the Revolutionary War that broke out in April of 1775, these representatives from all of the colonies met to decide what to do. They decided, how do we levy taxes? How do we raise money? How do we get what we want? And at that point, that was freedom, independence. So we decided we were fighting for our freedom, that we did not want a strong government, and we wanted our own. We wanted to break free of England. This early Congress was unicameral, meaning there was only one house, whereas today we have a bicameral Congress, which has two houses, which today is the Senate and the House of Representatives. And so, as you know, in 1776, we wrote on July 4th and signed the Declaration of Independence. And what it did was it announced to the world that we are independent from England, and it gave reasons why we revolted. This is very important. It gave reasons. And what that was, in order to do, was it gave all these other countries in Europe reasons why we were trying to fight against England. We were trying to find allies. Chief among them would be France, which still was upset with England. And so this was a plea for help. This is why the colonists were upset with England and were asking for allies to help aid us in our fight. And from this, many new national symbols came upon. Here you have the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, the Don't Tread on Me flag, which you see a lot today in the Tea Party movement, and other great imagery from the time. During this time, a lot of the power was held by the first states, and they made their own rules, and yet they were very similar. And so during this time, most of the power still resided in the states. And the common features of these new state governments were popular sovereignty, meaning that government can only exist with the consent or agreement of the people, that government is limited, that it has restricted and narrow powers, that there are certain civil rights and liberties, rights of the citizens, that cannot be infringed, they cannot be stopped. And finally, a separation of powers. Power cannot be vested with only one institution or person. It had to be split up, and that those different institutions could regulate each other. That is where we leave off with early America and the American Revolution. Thank you for watching, and have a wonderful day.